Yeah. Well, I'll continue to monitor as folks come in, but we're so glad that you all are here tonight. My name is Blake Kimsey. I'm with Writing Workshops Dallas in North Texas, and so glad you're here for the Big Texas Read, which David Samuel Levinson, one of our co-founders, along with Alexandra Van de Kamp, who is the executive director down at Gemini Ink in San Antonio. So we've been doing this, how long, you all? It's maybe since March?
April 15th. April 15th.
Tax day. Yeah, tax day. You're right.
April. Yeah. And we have some more already scheduled into the new year, which will be fun. But tonight we have a couple special guests for you. We're going to talk about gloss, of course. And so I'm going to hand it over to Alexandra, who will introduce, we'll make our introductions. And I just do want to always have to thank Interrobang Books here in Dallas for partnering with us on the Big Texas Read, as well as the Twig Bookshop down in San Antonio. I know with COVID and stuff, I know their sales have been impacted, so you can still order their books online. I want to thank Lone Star Literary for helping us spread the word about this. So maybe some of you heard about this through Lone Star Literary, as well as University of Texas San Antonio Library System. They've also been really great about helping us get the word out. So thank you to them. And of course, there's no Big Texas Read without our great authors and then all of the audience here tonight. So thank you for being with us tonight. And I'm going to hand it over to Alexandra.
Hey everyone, I'm so glad to have you here. I'm a poet, so tonight I love all of our Big Texas Reads, but I'm going to happily be in my poetic element with this conversation tonight. So we're featuring Wendy Barker, and I'll introduce her in just a moment. And then of course, Natalia Trevino will be our featured moderator. So we're very excited to have both of these amazing powerhouse poets with us tonight. And Gemini Ink is San Antonio's Writing Arts Center. Believe it or not, we've been around for 27 years, and we offer low-cost creative writing classes, a lot of free literary events. We want to get people involved with the literary arts, fed by them, and then we would just want to grow the creative voices of San Antonio and beyond. And we love events like this, where we're bringing writers literally into your living room now, or some room in your house, and you're able to experience some of the great voices of our times, of which Wendy Barker is one. So I'm going to introduce Wendy Barker. She has such a rich career. I don't believe I can do her justice, but I will give you some of the highlights. She is an award-winning poet with a very prolific career. She's published 7 books of poems. Gloss is her 7th, and it was published by St. Julian Press just in January, right, Wendy? Very recent publication. Her 6th book, One Blackbird at a Time, was chosen for the John Ciardi Prize and was published by BKMK Press. Am I butchering that title? Is that correct?
They pronounce it bookmark.
Okay, that's so much better than what I just said.
I had to learn that too, Alexandra. I didn't know either.
No, it's a great press. I've heard of them, and I've always wondered how to pronounce that. So Bookmark Press, that was in 2015. Her 5th chapbook is Shimmer, published by Glass Lyre Press in 2019. Earlier books include her novel and prose poems, Nothing Between Us, The Berkeley Years, which was a runner-up for the Del Sol Prize and released by Del Sol Press in 2009. Her other books of poems are Poems from Paradise, Way of Whiteness, Let the Ice Speak, that's a great title, and Winter Chickens. She's a recipient of an NEA Fellowship, a Rockefeller Residency Fellowship in Bellagio, as well as other awards in poetry, including the Writers League of Texas Book Award, which she's received twice. Wendy Barker has also been a Fulbright Senior Lecturer in Bulgaria, and her work has been translated into Hindi, Chinese, Japanese, Russian, and Bulgarian. She's a poet in residence and the Pearl Lewin Endowed Chair at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where she has taught since 1982. Wendy is married to the critic, biographer, and poet Stephen G. Kellman. And I just thought, I'm just stealing one of the blurbs from the back of her book because it's so beautifully written. I feel like it's a wonderful just thing to hear about gloss before we begin our discussion. And this was written by poet Alicia Ostreicher. She sums up Wendy Barker's deft and haunting take on family in her blurb. And she says this: her touch is as delicate as the family silver and as tough as the family secrets. Her meanings are as richly ambiguous as the word gloss itself. polishing, concealing, interpreting. All those shinings at the surface of things, and all those thready, stony rivulets in a family history, a history of mothers and grandmothers and great-grandmothers and aunts, involving years of posh and poverty. Barker sets them out as on a showcase framed in silk with a double gloss of precision and compassion. So that's from the wonderful poet Alicia Ostreicher. And then I'm delighted to be turning this conversation over to Natalia Trevino. She's our featured moderator. Natalia was born in Mexico and is the author of the poetry book Virgin X and the full-length collection Lavando La Dirty Laundry, a national international awards finalist. A professor of English at Northwest Vista College in San Antonio, she learned English from Sesame Street's Bert and Ernie, I love that story, and writes to embrace her binationality and biculturalism, having become a naturalized citizen at the age of 15. A graduate of the University of Nebraska's MFA in Creative Writing program and UTSA, her awards include the Alfredo Cisneros del Moral Award, the Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Poetry Award, the San Antonio Arts Foundation Literary Award, among other distinctions. And I'm so thrilled to have her be our featured moderator tonight. So please, I'm handing it over to you, Natalia, and just take it away. But we will be having Wendy begin with a reading, correct?
Yes.
So,
reading.
So Wendy, you're gonna give us the pleasure of reading about 4 poems, correct?
Yeah, that's fine. Is
Okay,
Natalia
great.
gonna talk first, or?
Yeah, Natalia, do whatever you want. I'm gonna let you take it from here. Yeah.
Could I ask one thing? My niece Wendy Pyatt is trying to get in. She needs to be let in from the waiting room,
Oh,
apparently.
You know, I think I let her in. I think she's on the 323 number.
Yeah.
Wendy,
Yeah.
if you can hear us, just say something in the chat or.
Well, I'm not sure. And
I
don't-
saw her chat earlier. I saw it come in, but
Well, what can we
maybe
do?
she got kicked out.
I see her as one of the participants, but
She's here, but apparently she says, well, I don't know. Don't worry. We'll do what we can.
Well, maybe it'll sort out, or maybe log in and log
Yeah.
out again if she can hear
Maybe
us.
so. Yeah.
Well, they're going to let people in,
Yeah.
but what an incredible honor it is to be moderating this conversation about gloss with my dear friend, my dear friend, my mentor, my poetry madre, and my poetry goddess, Wendy. We do want to invite you to begin with your reading, and then after your reading, I will proceed to ask you some questions I've been thinking about, some things we've talked about with gloss, and some things that really became apparent after I had a really deep look at it. So thank you so much for doing this, and I can't wait to hear you read.
Thank you. Oh, precious Natalia. Oh my goodness. Dear friend who's become one of my great supporters. We go back a long way. We go back to the late 80s, right? precious little sister Natalia.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Alexandra, this is so wonderful. Thank you so much. And David, it's so great what you guys have been doing. And Blake, my goodness. So it's just, thank you so much, all of you. This is just a delight. You know, it's so funny with COVID. There were all these trips planned, you know, to go read from the book and everything, go out of town, but couldn't do those. But here we are. You know, did a few things in January, and now here we are. So thank you all so much for being here. It's so wonderful to see so many people. Joan, I just noticed you're here. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so many. Mo, hi. And Steve got to join us. Now there's Calvin. Hi, Calvin. Oh my goodness. Okay, I should shut up and start reading, right? Gloss began in 2012. My sister Trisha, my two sisters, Trisha and Liza, from different parts of the country, we were together for the first time ever without husbands and children. And we began talking about experiences we'd had. My sister Trisha was working on a memoir and talking about traumatic experiences she had had. And we started talking about our mother's life, and I realized I had to write about my mother. I grew up in a series of mostly working class neighborhoods, moving. I went to 11 different schools in 12 years, mostly growing up in Tucson, also Phoenix, but grew up in Tucson during the years when us white kids and Mexican kids went to school all together, junior high and high school. Anyway, what didn't make sense was where my mother came from. She came from big money in England. I only met her mother 4 times in my life, her father 3 times. They were like people from another planet. I mean, yes, they talked English, but it wasn't the English we were talking. So in 2012, I realized I had to start tracing my mother's background. And this book begins with several epigraphs. I'm going to read one of them. I don't very much care what people do, as long as they don't do it in the street and frighten the horses, said King Edward VII. It gives you a clue to what happens later on. So here's a fairly early poem in the book. This is one of the prose poems. The book is composed of prose poems, long lineated poems, kind of ultra talky poems, and also a series of little syllabic poems meditating on a Chinese scroll that did not belong to my mother's family, but belongs to my husband, Steve. And I began just really feeling that this scroll was almost like a metaphor. I'll read one of these poems later. Almost a metaphor for the journey I was taking. Okay, here's a prose poem early in the book. The RMS Queen Mary. Docked since 67 in Long Beach, the same liner Mom sailed in 39 from England to marry my father. Relic of a past the well-heeled now are recreating, cruise being the upscale way for travel, like the tour labeled Alaska's Glorious Inside Passage in 8 days, or the one advertised as Wonders of the Mekong, 10 days down South Asia's amazing river. But the Queen Mary was not designed for this sort of travel, rather to get you from Southampton to New York in less than a week. From one life to another. Within a year, Mom had lost most of her Britishisms, but not all. Oh, you Americans, she'd shudder at us daughters, though she carried on with Thanksgiving and the 4th of July. The phrase carry on holds more weight than hand luggage. Alone on the Queen Mary, not part of any migration, no soft-bosomed granny, no jocular uncles to keep her afloat. Those glossy first-class cabins were kept spotless, then repainted, reupholstered, refurbished. Not a trace of her. And here's one of the little poems meditating on the scroll. These are written in syllabics. They're very sort of short. I don't know whether this can't see, sort of short-lined poems. I think more like 6 or 7 syllables to a line. Maybe his boat is drifting back toward the mouth of the river. Or he's grown tired from the long push and the banks down farther lure him with the fine silt of easy slopes, silky tendrils. Perhaps under the mountain's mist, something hides he fears he will reach. One of the prose poems later in the book. Latent image. Before she died, Mom pulled that photo out of the album, tore it to shreds. The one that showed her at 7, naked, posed like a nymph, a statue on the lawn. Grandfather's insisting she strip in front of the servants and sit like that, her legs folded to one side, her head bent in the opposite direction. His little nymph. Stilled in that photo, caught by silver particles, the standard black and white photographic process introduced in 1871. A photo's final image, metallic silver embedded in a gelatin coating. Stills, we say, stopped action, a single frame of a film. Yet I never knew Mom stilled until she died, her trim body beneath a sheet, always moving, vacuuming every crumb of dust to be sucked into the guts of the Electrolux, its bag emptied into the garbage and gone. After dinner, Ed Sullivan on TV, her hands working a needle or scissors, her feet joggling, toes wriggling. Daytime, her sewing machines roar, her fingers zipping the fabric toward the needle, her foot pressing the pedal, full speed, and driving, always over the limit, as if to say, get me out of here. Silver atoms, freed when silver salts meet the light, form an image that's stable. Once the film's developed, it's bathed in a chemical fixer. Clean water clears the fixer from the print, and the latent image becomes permanent. The story she told me long after I moved away, how, when at 13, she asked her mother what she should do about the black hairs spiraling in her armpits. Granny said, Father can help you with that. And he did, in the shower, every week, shaving her. One of the last poems in the book. Gathering Bones. Like a book, Mom said about life. You turn the page and go on. The same way she moved in and out of houses. Garage sale after sale. Each year like a chapter torn from a novel spine and hurled. Some of us go back looking for patterns. The way a plot builds chapter upon chapter, like a pelvis resting on the femur, femur on the patella, on the tibia and fibula. That film I can't forget. Aftermath, story of a Catholic Polish farmer who discovers Jewish tombstones buried under the town's road. He's obsessed with digging them up. 5-foot rounded headstones, one by one. Doesn't know why. He plants them in rows like corn in his field. Learns Hebrew, reads the inscriptions, names and names. During the months before she died, when I begged her to talk about her childhood, my mother changed the subject, demanded more milk in her tea. Let sleeping dogs lie, the villagers, even the young priest, warned that farmer. Years ago, Mom told me about a nightmare. She was racing, breathless, through a walled Corinthian garden to save herself from a gigantic man. How many houses had it taken to escape? New Jersey, Arizona, house after house, different towns, and finally, in less than a decade, 3 houses in New Hampshire, each one repainted. At the film's end, the farmer learns it was his father who led the villagers in a roundup of the local Jews, locking them in the family's cottage, which he set on fire. The night before the family's ceremonial scattering of Mom's ashes on the lake she loved, I slept with a canister beside me. Sunrise, I carried it down to the dock, opened the lid. I reached in, gathered a small handful, and over my arms and legs spread powdery flakes of crushed bone. I slipped then into the water that carried them, glittering in the light. Once I dreamed of myself as a toddler, walking down an unlit hospital hall with closed doors on both sides. I was holding my mother's hand. But no, she was gripping mine.
Wow. Some snapping. Oh, Wendy, that glittering image at the end of that poem it just takes my breath away. It's just so beautiful and so painful. And those last words, she was gripping mine just really resonates so much. And we're going to talk about the way you weave the stories into this book so beautifully, so deftly, as Alexandra said. Thank you so much for sharing that and reading them, and also for giving us a small glimpse of the progression of the poems and the interlacing of the kinds of poems that you're writing. So I've been reading a lot about narrative lately, and as a writer and a poet interested in narrative works, narrative poems, and as a teacher especially helping my students unlock their voices with narratives, I am perpetually interested. And as I read Gloss, I was aware that a story was unfolding, a narrative meditating on objects of inheritance, the ivory, the silver. Many who have not yet read the book, and who, those of you who have, may have been surprised and delighted, I hope, by the swing in the book, the poems, the waves that are in this book, much like the waves of water on the scroll and the waves of water there in that last beautiful poem. The balance of these tiny Chinese scroll poems, as thick as 2 fingers maybe, that focus on the single fisherman in the boat, and he's traveling upstream. And then the bigger story here, the second flood in the book, the looser poems, the prose poems, the family narrative. So you mentioned earlier how this idea came to you with the conversation with your sisters and meditating on this Chinese scroll that belongs to Steve. And you used the word metaphor, but I want to explore that a little bit more. Because you have these 2 kinds of poems, well, multiple kinds of poems together, but these 2 giant strands, so different in content, in structure. Can you talk about how you structured this book, Wendy? So interesting, these tiny poems interspersed with the family drama that crosses vast oceans, epic oceans of landscape and time and memory going back 3 generations. Just the decision to interlace these stories. How did that make sense to you as a book?
It was a nightmare putting it together. Trying to figure out how it was a matter of trying to decide, well, the narrative pace, and also the sense of this emotional journey, this journey into family background that was leading up to very, very painful, awful stuff. That on the surface looked real pretty. The book was originally called Privilege, and then we decided that wouldn't work. And then we tried Tarnish, and one of my friends said, no, that gives too much away. And then finally, I hit on Gloss, which I was pleased with because it can be read 2 ways, as a noun, but also as a verb, the way you could explain and define something. But it was very difficult trying to figure out, with a long process of placing poems in different places. And actually the scroll poems, the little scroll meditative syllabic poems, helped in a way, because there was the parallel of this tiny man and this tiny boat, and this big long scroll that shows him going way up the stream toward these high mountains, became a sort of metaphor for the journey. What would be underneath this river, and frightening things that would happen on the way. And so interspersing those scroll poems became very helpful. But it was very difficult trying to figure out how to place the poems. And basically it was just a sort of matter of leading up to revealing I shouldn't reveal it because you haven't all read the book yet. There's Zach. Hi, Zach. Revealing the I guess tragedy, I could say, of this very privileged woman, but yet the truth of what her history with her father had been. You can guess from what I'm saying, how she never wanted to talk about her childhood, and it was just, and I was so curious, because these relatives were fascinating to me. These relatives who I hardly ever met. And Granny would send me books from England, and that was wonderful. But they were like people, as I said, from another planet. So the book was a way of ordering the book was trying to trace up the river, trying to get to the source, I guess you could say, of where this strain began. Yeah.
That's
We had to move and move and move and move and move, and everything was always thrown out, and never had anything from one year to another, and that kind of thing. Yeah. Does that help?
very much. And it's so interesting because the scroll poems feel like a scroll in the size of them and the shape of them. And then they sort of land in these pools of depth when we get into these longer prose poems, these ultra talky poems. And we really go into the layers of the story there, and then we sort of land there, and then we go back to this story. And of course, we're trying to figure out what's the connection. And one of the places where I felt there was a huge revelation is in the placement of the poem Silk Roads on page 21, where the parallels between the Chinese scroll and, of course, the story of great-grandfather who experienced trade in China, and so there starts to be this reference, or maybe a resonance between that male figure and possibly who's on a boat, and the waters are choppy and difficult, and then the fisherman, and that starts to become a question, part of the mystery in this book, the unfolding. And then there starts to be so many parallels between the speaker's journey and the fisherman. So there's just this real interesting combination and journey that you take us on. So thank you for.
That's brilliant, Natalia. That's brilliant.
Well, you're the one. You're the brilliant one that put that together. And I think I'm gonna. I want to go to another question. So there's so much emphasis in this book on beauty, on sheen, on lines, explodingly beautiful ivory, the tureen who speaks and crashes open and claps open, that has a story of her own. The tureen, I feel, is another great voice.
Yes. Yeah.
The water lilies, women's beauty and sexuality, of course. But there's also a huge emphasis on information in this book to help the reader understand the world of this book. I find it delightful and rich. This book is an education. In the long, generous sentences that are filled with historical information, etymological, I can't say, etymology, the etymology of words and history of words, punctuating the book with important memories, unfolding the story of these four women, your story, your mother's, your grandmother's, and then your wonderful great granny Lillian Graves. That's such an interesting story. I want to ask you, what is your theory or your belief on giving a reader a balance between this emphasis on beauty and then just here's some information, people. So much history in this book, and then in the context of so much artifice.
What are you asking me, Natalia?
So your theory on the balance between the beauty and the information, the giving, being a teacher in the book, giving the reader, and especially as you think about helping us, because we don't want to, we don't all know how necessarily to give information in a book or in a poem.
Interesting question. I never thought of it that way. This is fascinating, Natalia. I'm not surprised. I guess you mentioned the silver poems. Interspersed throughout are these poems meditating on pieces of silver that I did not grow up with. I did not grow up in a luxurious environment by any means, but pieces of silver that I inherited and that Steve and I have. And one of them is this tureen. It was and it truly, we do use it to store garlic. And the dome of it really does sometimes come crashing open. And that became a metaphor for smelly stuff that you can't hide, that's going to come open no matter what. Even if you're just walking by the tureen and smash, it's going to crash open. and there will be the smell of the garlic.
Yeah.
Which I think in the poem I mentioned that my mother detested.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. She disdained anything Italian. She grew up on macaroni and cheese because sometimes that was the only thing we could afford to have. I don't know what she thought that was. But so Natalia, I don't think I'm answering your question, but somehow these objects became metaphors. And there's a very, I hope it's subtle, I hope it's not too obtrusive, but the book is really making, I hope, a very strong comment and criticism of colonialism. I mean, it really is. It's that poem that you mentioned about the ivory carving with the elephant's teeth and where that ivory comes from. And so the history of the way my mother was treated by her father almost being emblematic of the way the British treated many of the subjects in the countries they, quote, invaded. So it's subtle, but I hope it's there, that I'm actually making a critique of a kind of individual behavior that can be seen as a metaphor for a country's behavior. Not that I'm totally anti-Brit. I adore. In fact, Downton Abbey was going on while I was writing these poems. Following Downton Abbey really, really helped. And speaking of the upstairs downstairs thing, can I just bring in about my grandmother, my granny, who I only met 4 times? Granny was a governess. She was the daughter of a woman who was gorgeous. Beauty was hugely important in our family. And there's a poem about it. In fact, I was not beautiful. My little sister was beautiful, my mother. Beauty was hugely important. Granny, great granny, was gorgeous. And she was widowed at something like 22 or 23 with 4 kids. Her husband was an alcoholic. She farmed the 4 kids out to different relatives. And she farmed out my granny, mom's mother, to a vicar and his wife. So Granny was brought up very strictly, very good education, and became a governess in the finest of homes. Okay, so Granny is a governess with this. Oh, and what I should mention, one of the poems talk about this, is Granny's mother then, widowed now, went on the stage to trod the boards, if you know what I mean. She became a dance hall girl. Very acceptable in any circles, right? In fact, there's a poem that goes into detail about that. Anyway, so Granny, a governess, is governessing in some very wealthy house, very wealthy home, and meets grandfather, whose father had started this very lucrative export company, and Granny and grandfather fell in love. So Granny married, as my mother would say, Granny married way up. She did very well for herself. Anyway, enough on that.
No, that's a great anecdote. But it's also interesting that I'm glad that you mentioned that the book is a critique of colonialism, and one of the things that I think you do really well in the book, and I think others will agree when they read it, is you talk about the privilege very openly, and you criticize it, and that's where those history lessons sort of start to come in, like with the Polish, even the film with the Polish farmer that we
Right, the aftermath.
Yeah. Right, and you reveal this as I think a white writer should reveal in this day and age when we're talking so much about white privilege and people and the privilege gap with people of color. And so it's beautiful and refreshing to see that critique, sort of to see the artifice come off and go in. And I think that's a really compelling, heartfelt act of bravery in the book. But I want to ask you another question. I think that there's a lot of feminist work here, and I know that you've been working on feminist ideas for many years, dealing with trauma, dealing with exposing oppression that women face in marriage, in family, and in their health, their mental health, their physical health, everything. And I think you and I have talked a lot about this. There's much feminist work needs to be done in this world. And this book, I believe, is a real deep part of that, and is going to be a great voice in that conversation because it looks past the gloss and what we cover up, right? The sheen of privilege, exposing the pain behind the stiff upper lip that a lot of people who have experienced trauma will face the world with, right? But as someone who's lived through the 60s and seeing the world we live in today, always, and you being always connected to young students as a professor, and always connected to women and women's literature, where do you see these stories today? Why these stories today, Wendy? And is, I know that there's some of what I've talked about here, the exposing of oppression, but as you look at the arc of feminism, where do you see this book?
Wow, that's a really important question, and I'm not sure how to answer it. Maybe other people could answer it better, but I hope it adds to the dialogue. I mean, I hope it adds to the getting the truth out there. You know, when a student just says in class that she's just been raped, for instance, you know, a woman student, okay? And we've come a long way. Oh my gosh, have we come a long way. You know, when I was first on the job market in 1982, and Steve has heard me tell this story 9 trillion times, so Steve, just bow out for a moment. But I was on the job market in 82, and one of my fields was feminist theory and women's literature, among many other things that I could teach. But at that time, English departments across the country were all male, and everybody was looking for a female to hire. And so I was so lucky. I had all these great offers. And the reason I just fell in love with San Antonio, and it was like coming home to Tucson. There was no question which job I was going to take. It was coming home to Tucson in San Antonio, the similarities. And so no mountains. But other than that, yes. So we've come a long way. And I think our department, Steve, is now more women than men, right? So, I mean, we've come a long way. But these problems of sexuality, these problems of physical trauma, that poem that I didn't want to read because it's so long and it's so traumatic about surgery, a little history. I mean, there's still things going on, medical trauma, which that poem is about. So yeah, we've got a long way to go. There's a lot of work to do. And I know that people like Abby are doing the work. They're doing the work for us. They are, and not just Abby, but Ivana, and the great men among us like Calvin, Zach, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So there is so much work to do, and you dive into these truth tellings with so much courage that it's breathtaking and so much beauty. Bringing in the ancient story of Leda, and bringing that all the way through the book with the feathers and the beaks that come into different places in the book, as y'all will see as you read it or as you've read it or want to go back and look for tracing how these feathers work, how this myth of Leda works. And then, of course, the myth of Philomena, which is just absolute pain, but really showing how timeless these questions are for women. And I think your book definitely reaches into those mythic giant scopes by having those illusions, and also by linking them to the life of this family, this family that is, could be anybody, could be anyone's family. Yeah,
that's so good the way you put that. And yes, that it's part of an old story.
Yeah. Something interesting that I wanted to talk about on this issue of feminism is that interplay between the fishermen, the masculine, the men in the book, and the speaker and the women. And we talked about how he becomes a metaphor, or there's so many similarities between him and the speaker in terms of the journey of fishing, but because the speaker, of course, is also fishing. She's also searching and landing. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about that idea of the male-female balance in the book, or as you saw it unfolding to you.
I never thought of it that way.
Huh.
In terms of a male-female balance. I never thought of it that way. The man in the boat was just somebody in a boat, just fishing and going. It's interesting and it's fascinating. I love that you point that out. But that was never conscious. It was just, I mean, certainly I get into the, my father's quoting where was, I'm forgetting. Steve helped me out when Cordelia.
Yeah.
Was Cordelia, what was it? She never spoke loudly or something. Her voice was, here it is. Her voice was ever soft and low, an excellent thing in woman. And my father would quote that all the time, that we shouldn't, as girls, we should not have raucous voices. And as girls, we had to be beautiful. And I was not. I mean, I was this tall when I was, I think, 10. So there's, so Natalia, thank you. There is those expectations, for especially growing up in my generation and maybe Carol's, the expectations for us as girls and how we were supposed to grow up.
I think a lot of young women still feel that. I mean, I know my students do. They're still very entrenched in these feelings and expectations. And so we need our women to speak up about this. And this book definitely does. One of the things I love, and I think that a lot of people here love about Wendy as a person and a professor, as a friend, and as a writer especially, is her honesty. And this book delivers honesty in a chilling and elegant manner, one worthy of your elegant mother. I think that, I don't know. I mean, this had to be a breathtakingly beautiful book because I think about your mother's aesthetic and what we've talked about, whose most private life is being explored here. But for the good of your responder, the good of your reader, who may also be handling a glossed version of reality or projecting a glossed version of reality, as people do on social media, etc. Your book, Wendy, is a map for women, a lifeline. It's so brave and honest. And I want to ask you about the courage that it takes and took you to question these truths and to face them. What was that like for you, if you don't mind me asking?
No, not at all. The writing just had to be. It had to be. The poems just had to be written. They came. The courage part came when the book was accepted and was going to come out, and what would my son, David, and my two sisters think of this book? And I was terrified of what they would think. And what I couldn't believe was that David just adored it and even commented on the structure. He was just blown away by how the little syllabic scroll poems were interwoven with the longer poems. So, I mean, that was the biggest relief, because he has been upset by some of the things I've written before and published. And I've explained to him, I have to write what I have to write. I have to publish what I have to publish. You don't have to read it. But so that was that was the most frightening thing of all. And what a relief. And then next frightening was my sister's reactions. What would they think? And they too adored it. They just raved about it. They were thrilled, and they were thrilled to have Mom's story told. And I had the feeling that Mom wanted her story told somehow. That this is I had to do. This is what I had to do for her. If there's ways I'd failed her as a daughter, in many ways I had failed her as a daughter, this is something I had to do after she died. So, but it was when the book came out that the courage that the fears really surfaced.
That's so beautiful. And when you mentioned in the poem that what she told you years and years later, what she remembered happening. And that's like the terrain that just says, I'm going to speak.
right. Exactly.
Great.
Yes.
And I think this definitely honors her story because it is so beautiful and so beautifully put together. Wow. I have one last question. I think we have time for it too. So thank you so much, Wendy, for going there, because a lot of writers are, especially when they're poetry is the greatest nonfiction, right? It's the most elegant, it's the most beautiful nonfiction. And a lot of writers, I think they're afraid sometimes to really tell the truth, and they gloss over their stories. But this book gives them, that's why I said it's a map, because it guides us on how to speak. This Zoom series specifically, the Big Texas Read, was born, as many of you know, out of the pandemic. And while it's been quite a year for everybody, presented us with so many challenges, pains, losses, fears, and so much oppression of our spirits, our hopes. There's so much. I mean, I don't have to say it. We all know. When I face a crisis, I think about the paradox of it. It's the only thing that keeps me going, the wholeness of it. And it's in the lines by William Butler Yeats, Easter 1916. I think maybe a lot of poets might go to that. You know, a terrible beauty is born. And that's how I get through some of the things that are going to want to rip my head off. I wanted to ask you, Wendy, yes, it's been a hard year, but and I think this series has been one of the gifts of the pandemic. I think that this is one of the beauties that have been born, as we were saying earlier, this Jetsons feeling that we have, that we can just kind of click on and see each other. We didn't have to drive, and we're all in our homes, but yet we're together in this cyber space, in the cyber living room, whatever we want to call it. Wendy, what are some of the gifts of the pandemic that you might want to in your life or as a writer? Have there been moments of beauty or a gift or something that's happened that you realized this is because of the pandemic, and it's given me something? I just think it's good to note, to think about our gratitude, and I work a lot on this with my students. Because yes, our mind is programmed, especially right now, to scan for the negative and be alarmed by it, and sort of becomes a little addicted to that, right? So we can train our mind to scan also for something restful or a relief. So are there gifts in the pandemic?
This, as you mentioned, I mean, just being able to be like this. I mean, we probably couldn't have all gathered in the same way, physically, and just not having to drive, and get all dressed up, and we can't see what we're wearing really, which is kind of wonderful. I haven't worried about clothes for months. Being able to gather like this and see a little bit of each other's rooms, and Abby, the way we do in our class, and Zach, when we can see people's kitties crawling all over the computer, and puppies, and so that is a gift, being able to gather in a different kind of way. And interestingly, there is a different kind of intimacy in this. I mean, I miss terribly, as Zach and Abby know. I've talked about this so much. I miss painfully not being able to be together physically, to look at their poems and talk about their poems on paper together. But at the same time, we can all be together like this. So it's a different kind of intimacy. And I really cherish that. There are things we miss, but yet this is a game. I've been in readings on Zoom where there are people there from New York, from Cleveland, from San Francisco, from Alaska. Somebody was there from the Philippines. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to get together like that except on Zoom. So that's kind of a wonderful thing that we have. The other thing, and I'm kind of hesitant to bring this up because it's so new, a new feeling. At first, during the shutdown, and my doctor ordered me, you just self-isolate completely, utterly. So I basically see two human beings, Steve and my chiropractor. And that's it. Those are the people I see physically. Thank goodness for Steve, without whom I wouldn't be able to function in all kinds of ways. So at first, the extrovert side of me was just starving. Those of you who know me, I really enjoy being with friends and, having people over and getting, but at first that was I was painful. And of course, I miss hugging people. But what's happened more recently in the last couple of months is a strange kind of calm, sort of feeling that, no, I don't have to go there. I don't have to go there. I don't have to go there. So the poems I've been writing have been these little syllabic poems again, little syllabic poems about the Felix wren coming to my screen outside my study window, or just the sounds of the house, and just kind of being present in maybe a more calm way than I ever have before. I don't have to go anywhere. It's all right. I mean, thank goodness for Netflix, right? And Amazon Prime, and my wonderful students.
Yeah.
But there's a kind of calm that has come. And I think, for me at least, there'll be some really reevaluation once the restrictions are limited, once maybe the virus kicks in and COVID is not so frightening. I'm going to have to think carefully about what I want to commit to outside the house. I'm sort of having this sense of how frenzied, in a way, my life, partially retired, has been. So does that help? Is that kind of?
Yeah, that's really, really great to hear. I think you've verbalized what maybe a lot of writers are missing, which is some reflection, time for reflection,
Yeah.
time to have quiet, to hear, and listen more, which is what we need to do as writers. We need to listen, and maybe being in touch with nature more, or with our own homes, getting to know our own spaces more, our pets. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Wendy. We are not done. We have time for Q&A from our audience, and Alexandra and Blake, I believe, are going to be moderating that. But I might pop in and ask a question or comment, or who knows. So I'm excited about this conversation. It's been really interesting. And thank you for letting me explore your beautiful mind.
Oh, Natalia, thank you for your amazing questions. And you are so precious and brilliant. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh my goodness, Alexandra and David and Blake. Oh, thank you so much for this chance. And can I respond to something Jean Hackett wrote in the chat?
Oh, yes.
Jean wrote in the chat, oh, can I say this? You said privately. Is this okay, Jean, if I read it out loud?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Jean asked what I think my mother and grandmother would have thought of this book.
Mm.
I'm quite sure that Granny would not have approved at all. I think in a way my mother would have been grateful. I think she would have been grateful. She might have been upset. I don't know. But I think in a way she needed her story told. So I'm not sure. Yeah.
So I guess, Natalia, thank you so much. That was beautiful, the conversation. And Wendy, your questions, well, your answers are so rich. I think we could talk for hours about this book. It's very it just kind of unfolds and unfolds with more ways to talk about it, to think about the themes. This is, quote unquote, everyone, the audience Q&A. You can post a question in the chat, or just mention your name in the chat and Blake can unmute you and you can just ask it yourself. We love to hear from our audience members, and it's so nice to see how you're experiencing the book or the conversation tonight. We did have a few pre-submitted questions, some of which were from me, Wendy, I have to admit.
Great, that's great.
So I'm going to be really selfish and begin with one of mine. And then David, you had a great question. We'd love to hear it. And then everyone else, just feel free to just ask us if you want to ask a question. We'd love to hear from you. This came up in your poem, Gathering Bones, but I saw it in others. And I kind of see it as you have this amazing ability to toggle between like two stories in one poem. And often they're in different periods of time. Like in Gathering the Bones, what's that on page 43? That's such a great, sorry, 57. You're talking, you read that at the beginning tonight, Wendy. You talk about your mother and and how she moved and she moved from house to house, garage sale after sale. And then we go back to this description of this movie Aftermath, where a Polish farmer, is a completely different context, completely different theme. And he's suddenly obsessed with these stones buried in the earth of his village. And of course, what he discovers about them. I'm just impressed at how you're able to hold those two realities together in one poem, and it works. So is that like something you do on purpose? Like you're like, okay, I'm going to layer these two stories together. I think there's a thread that connects them, or is it something that you just find yourself writing about it? Because it's no small feat.
Oh, thank you, my goodness. That poem came about because I was working on these poems, and Steve and I saw the film Aftermath, which touched me deeply, and I realized that there's a connection here. And that especially, and I remember writing this down during watching the movie, let sleeping dogs lie, the villagers, even the young priest warned that farmer, let sleeping dogs lie. That was a trigger, the connection between my mother's story and this story. Yeah. And there it's the father who burned down the barn full of, the cottage, and then set them on fire. So again, it's the father. Yeah,
because it's kind of amazing because first of all, I want to see that movie. But it kind of, obviously the farmer's digging down and finds something, and this is what the speaker is doing in the book. So you're obviously seem to be really good at just listening to your instincts when you're writing, you know what I mean? Which isn't so easy to do, right? A lot of times the writer can have an instinct. They're like, oh no, that can't be true. And they don't follow it, but you seem to be really good at that. So I'm grateful for your just sense of intuition there, because I really loved that part of this book. You know what I mean? These different stories layered together, one kind of highlighting the other.
Oh, thank you. That's something that, Abby, I don't think I talk enough about to students. I don't think I've shared this. Where'd Abby go? Where's Abby? There you are. Okay, Abby. Okay. I've said this enough to you guys, Zach, that you get these instincts, you have these little moments, suddenly something comes and you got to write it down, even if it's 2:00 in the morning. You got to write those things down when they come, because it's suddenly the mind is working, and you got to follow those instincts. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I've sometimes thought, and I'll say this and then be quiet because I want to hear from other people, but I sometimes have thought that genius is just the ability for a thinker or a writer to follow something all the way to its end, like a thought, like they just go down further that road than maybe someone else would. And that leads them to these new revelatory places. What do you think of that, Wendy? I mean, obviously not the only reason for genius, but I think I've seen that a few times in writing, that it's made me think about that. Like someone just goes further down a certain road of thought and it gets them to these new places. And your book makes me think of that.
Thank you.
You know, while people are thinking about their questions, and I agree with you so much, Alexandra, but Wendy's doing this in a micro level in several individual poems, and then in the macro level with the whole entire structure of the book. And that very painful poem that you just mentioned, the Gathering Bones, comes right after one of the scroll poems on page 51, where we're warned that we're gonna go down. The poem, if Wendy, do you mind if I share this poem and read this?
Of course not. No, thank you.
So page 51, how a surface. I mean, right there, I just know, oh, the surface, because by this point, there's so much layering with the concept of surfaces. Can gleam in light, a crystalline slice, so you think you can avoid going under. And we're warned there about this question and the mystery and the tension between not going under, forward maybe with our intuition or our search, fishing, and going real under with, for example, this Gathering Bones story, which is precisely about that dig. So beautifully done. Such a great placement of that poem. Ugh. Keeps happening again and again in the book.
David, do you want to ask your question? You had a great question. Why don't you ask us yours?
Thanks.
Following Natalia's insights.
Thanks. It's not that great, but it's a question. Okay. So you're a poet. I've been to your house, you know. Steve is also a poet and a critic and an essayist, and I'm sure a fiction writer somewhere in there, and a whole host of other things. So Wendy, what is it like to share a house with another writer? I'm curious about that because every single writing couple I know has been Splitsville for a very long time. So you guys seem to have made it work for a very long time, and I'm curious how the hell that has happened.
Oh, it works beautifully. Oh my goodness. Oh,
Wow.
I mean, what could I be? What could I do without Steve? Oh my goodness. We send each other all of our writings. And of course, you know, Steve, you know, brilliant biographer, critic. I mean, he does everything. And I'm just, you know, and he has a memory that's unbelievable. I mean, as those of you who've taken this class at Zach, you know, right? I mean, he has this amazing memory, which I do not have. But it's heaven, because I have several friends with whom I share poems and get their feedback about as I'm working on them. And then the final reader is always Steve. What do you think? You know, Natalia says I should do this. Kevin says I should do this. What do you think I should do? Steve is always my last reader for everything. And he sends me all his stuff too. And believe it or not, is it okay if I say this, Steve? Believe it or not, once in a while I'll see some things that I would suggest he changes. They're usually very minor. And of course, his writing is brilliant. Our writings are so different. Now, David, it might be different if we were both doing exactly the same kinds of things. I don't know, but then I think of David Kirby and Barbara Hamby, who are both ultra talking poets and have a great marriage. You know,
well, maybe it's only the poets. Maybe the fiction writers can't really hack it.
That would be harder.
I guess. I don't know.
Yeah,
I love that story, though. I mean, I didn't want to pry into your marriage.
No,
But
it's
I was
fine.
curious about
No,
how
it's
long have you guys been married?
We've been together since 98. And
So a long time. Yeah.
we officially married in 2005. As far as we were concerned, we've been married since 1998.
Do you find that having someone on hand basically to be an editor has helped you produce more, or
Yeah.
yeah?
Oh, yes. Steve's help is invaluable. Absolutely.
Could I jump in? I noticed Alexandra mentioned Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath, an unfortunate example of
That
a
one.
literary couple. But I think a relevant question, given all of the talk about bearing painful secrets, Wendy, do you see any affinity between yourself and the so-called confessional poets, Plath and Sexton, Robert Lowell, and so on?
I don't know, do you?
Not especially.
I think there's more affinity with people like Hamby and Kirby, actually, for the ultra talky poems. But then the poems vary so much. You know, we think of the difference between the Berkeley poems, the Nothing Between Us, and then the teaching poems in Blackbird, and both of those books are kind of memoirs. So I don't know, but I don't see much. I don't know. What do y'all think?
Is not every poem sort of a little slice of memoir?
I guess so. Yeah, I guess so.
I don't know. That's
I
just
mean, I'm gonna pipe in. I mean, I when I think of persona poems, I don't know if all poets write out of memoir. I think some poets are trying to escape their reality, and I've seen some great poems written out of research on another like figure in the arts and the books about them. Now we could all have a long talk about how they're telling their story anyways, just through persona. But
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting question, David. Yeah, we could probably have a whole
I
seminar
have
on that.
another sort of poetry question. All the poets can think about this and answer me. I'm going to admit something that I probably shouldn't. I'm curious. I'm really curious because I finished a novel. I'm sorry. Anyway, I finished a novel and the narrator is biracial. I am having a seriously hard time finding an agent because of this. And I'm just curious if the same thing is happening in the poetry world. Like, I apparently am not allowed to write about a biracial man. And the book is about white privilege and it's about toxic masculinity, but they read it, they love it, then they find out that I'm actually like a Jew and they're like, so long, sucka. So I'm curious if this is happening in the poetry field as well.
David, you're raising a huge subject and we could talk for 5 hours about this. We really could, couldn't we? Yes, all of you are nodding your heads. And this is a real
very painful. It's so painful to have written a novel.
I feel for you. Yes.
I know, whatever, I'm not the greatest writer in the world, but I know that this book is somehow, I don't write anything that I don't think would be sort of important to some kind of discussion, you know? And I didn't write it out of any malice or anything like that, but I'm being treated as if,
subject in the whole literary.
I know, it's crazy.
Yeah.
There's no answer.
And I don't think we can answer that in the scope of the time we have here, but unless somebody wants to chime in.
But I'm curious about poetry. I mean, is there in poetry an own voices movement, or is it not so much? Because in fiction there is.
I'm not as aware of it in poetry. Natalia, Alexandra, what do you think?
I feel like I don't have the expertise. I'd have to think about that. It's a very good question to be asking. I would hesitate to try to sum up the poetry world right now, but yeah, it's a little hard. I can. How long have you been sending out the manuscript, David?
For about a month, and 3 agents have passed because they all love it. But
only sent it out for a month, but that's nothing.
No, they all love it. No, they all love it and want to take it on. Then they find out that I am not biracial or Black.
Keep sending it out.
Yeah.
It took me years to get gloss taken.
Yeah, but I feel dirty. I feel like I've done something wrong, you know? And I just wrote a book. That's all I did, you know? I'm curious now, when I was saying poetry, I thought every poet and I thought every poem was sort of autobiographical. I think, you know, all writing I think is autobiographical. Do you agree or not?
Ignacio, you're really grinning. Do you have something to add here?
Please.
Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Unmute. Ignacio, unmute yourself.
Thanks for reminding me. I teach a Zoom class and I do this all the time. Yes, I'm thinking it may be possible with the correct frame, because there's a difference between representing something. There's certain assumptions about what the writing is the relationship between the writing and the audience that is causing problems. Now, if you frame it correctly, and people know that you're doing this exploration, and that you yourself are not biracial, and you can think of an artful way of doing it. This is all theoretical. I've never seen this, but I think it may be possible through enough honesty to create the right formula. But it is a very touchy subject, and that's, I think, all I'll say for tonight.
Yeah, see,
Some very interesting, David, some very interesting things in the chat. And Abby has posted.
I mean, I don't want to be the poster boy for like any kind of our own voices sort of subject, but Lionel Shriver, I don't know if you guys have read Lionel Shriver. She wrote We Need to Talk About Kevin. She's very much into sort of, anti-political correctness, and that's not me, but it's become very rigid, super rigid in the fiction world. And I guess it's not in the poetry world because you guys don't seem to be. Natalia, do you want to?
Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I think in the fiction world, publishers are terrified after what happened with American Dirt.
Right, it's American.
No one wants to face that again. It was I don't know how costly it was for them because the book sold like pancakes, but the national dialogue that was very needed that happened after American Dirt did expose some of the mistakes that author made, and I think that it had to do with her lack of intimate knowledge and what she was representing about Mexican culture, and her attempting to write from a Mexican woman's perspective without having intimate knowledge of a Mexican woman's perspective. I don't think you have to be a Mexican woman to write with that perspective, but I think you need to have a lot of intimate knowledge and for it to come across. And then I think that author could have had Mexican American writers help her with the missteps that she took, where she glossed over things and got things wrong, and that no non-Mexican reader would catch, but Mexican American readers did catch, and especially those of us who were who have intimate knowledge of living in Mexico,
Right,
living here, and facing the world as a Mexican American or a Mexican person. So I think that they're in fiction world, which is so, and it really is money driven. The big houses are very money driven. It's very much about the bottom dollar, and they might be terrified of that happening. It might make them afraid or to approach, but I'm thinking of poets who can take on, do persona poems and can take on the voices of others that are from another race. And I think because, as Ignacio was saying, they really do their research, they dive into the voice, and maybe give a new perspective that is interesting and successful and layered. I guess with poetry, there's a different goal in voicing certain things, and with fiction, there's obviously we have fiction writers here who could speak about it beautifully, but I think a lot of that fear has to do with the crisis over American Dirt. So what to do? Do you revise? Do you undo? Do you find a smaller press that will be brave with you? Do you write under a pseudonym and hide your identity? I mean, there's so many terrible questions that you have to think about right now. But the question is what's the intent behind this biracial perspective, and how intimately is it being portrayed, and how necessary is it to portray it? How many biracial?
It's utterly necessary.
Yeah. So and how many biracial beta readers do you have who help you realize this is really good? This feels it. Maybe a few more, and then you are going to get, I think, a brave editor or agent. But right now, the world might be a little bit tender about that. So I would.
No, I appreciate that.
Beautiful comment, Natalia.
What's interesting about the premise of my book, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to take away from Wendy, we will get back to you in 5 seconds, I promise. But the premise is, it's about a white guy pretending to be a biracial guy who ends up having a very tragic end because of it. And it's very hard to sort of explain that this character has to be this way in order to get him to the end. Do you know what I mean? Like, whatever. We don't have to talk about this anymore. But I was curious about the poetry world because the fiction world is fucked.
I think it's different in poetry, but gosh, David, I know we all really feel for you, but I would suggest you do look up the article that Abby posted in the chat, and that what Alexandra says, you just need to find something to write home for the book. I mean, I sent gloss to, probably 60 different presses, minimally. And one that I really thought I had a good chance with, the reader said, oh, it's too disjointed. It doesn't all fit together. The poems are all too different, okay? And then, I don't know whether, I know Natalia has seen the Publishers Weekly review. I couldn't believe it when the book was reviewed in Publishers Weekly. I mean, I've never been reviewed in Publishers Weekly. And this great review came out in Publishers Weekly that said the same things that Natalia and Alexander were saying, praising the structure of the book. So, which was exactly the thing that had caused it to be rejected. So, I mean, it was years trying to find the right press. It's just, what we do is really hard. Steve and I talk about this all the time. This is hard fucking work. And the writing, it's what we have to do. Those of us who have to do it. It's what we have to do. I wouldn't be alive if I couldn't be writing poems, working on poems, drafting poems, revising. But then the flip side is trying to get things published, trying to get things out there, trying to get an audience. Yes, we write for ourselves, but we also want to be heard. And it's not easy. And there's so many of us out there. And yeah, so sorry, rant over. But it's just damned hard. It's hard work, and it takes persistence. It takes persistence and patience and courage and not giving up. Yeah, that's
beautifully said, Wendy. Yeah. No, and actually David's question kind of feeds into this whole thing of gloss, right? Which is what we're talking about, how deep are you digging? Are you really, what kind of truth is being, told by your book? No answer, no, not easy to necessarily answer, but good questions to be asking. I did want to, Alicia Garcia's been, Alicia, you wanted to ask a question, so please unmute yourself and ask it. Yeah.
Alicia.
Hi, Wendy. Hi, everybody. I'm so excited to be here. Oh, Wendy, it was such a treat as usual. It was just marvelous. But my question is about memory. And when you went to talk to your sisters about your mother's story, and when they read the final product, did you find that you remembered things differently than your sisters, like the same event differently, or that you experienced the same event differently? And I was wondering if that is true, how you managed to kind of wed all those versions together.
And I didn't talk to them about, I didn't show them these poems while they were being written at all. Between the time we talked together in Chicago in 2012 and Mom's history came up. Trisha was working on her own memoir and dealing with her history of sexual abuse, quite frankly. And I brought up Mom, and Trisha said, "That's Mom's story. I can't get that in there." And said something in me just said, I've got to write that story. And so they didn't see anything until the book came out. So, and they're much younger than I. So they, I think Trisha and I talked about hearing things about the same time, but as I said, they're much younger than I. And so they didn't dispute, they didn't have different memories, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah, yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, so good to see you, Alicia. Yeah. Yeah.
That's actually just to chime in, a great question. Because like Rashomon, you know, Kurosawa's film about the wonderful Japanese film director about how a woman's raped, and you hear people all his whole movie is the different points of view of people who quote unquote witnessed aspects of it, and everyone's story is different, right? So there's a long history in literature and film and art about that very slippery thing called memory. You know what I mean? And I'm noticing it more as I get older, right? Like you're like, oh, that happened, and then you realize you were totally wrong and your dates are off. But so did you run into any of that, Wendy? Like, well, some of your, there's immense research in your book, which and sort of a very personal type of research. You know, I think there was that one line in Silk Road where the speaker says, am I doing this correctly? Which poem is that?
Yes, Silk Road.
I want to slice through this story, unspool its lengths. And so were you relying, I mean, you said you didn't know these relatives very well, so you were relying on other people's memories in some ways, but did you run into issues where like, oh, what, you know, like how hard was it to unearth some of these secrets?
Mostly from things that Mom had told me over the years. I would just be relentless about trying to get her to tell me things. And I'm trying to find a poem later. I'm so glad you pointed out Silk Road, because there's a poem that comes later in the book, in which, as we're sort of unfolding the truth, okay, page 56, now I learn, okay, the story that Mom had always told me, I shouldn't say always, but the story she told me that I found so romantic and exotic was that my great-grandfather was the one who set out in the 19th century, sailed up the Yangtze and asked the Chinese, you know, to trade, but there was, and they said, no, go home, white devils. And then there was a storm and they said, we'll trade with you. And that started this whole really, really lucrative import-export firm, Dodwell and Company. But then when we get to Now I Learn on 56, story about great-grandfather sailing up the Yangtze, false. I found a volume from Oxford University Press, as well as files in the London Metropolitan Archives, setting the record straight. In a cardboard box buried in a closet, a blue cloth-bound book my grandfather published in 1958, The House of Dodwell. It's even on Wikipedia. It was William Adamson who was the man who in 1852 came back from China with a ship loaded with silk and the embryo of fortune. George Benjamin Dodwell had only been a year old. So later, he joined the office. He joined the office of the firm and later became chairman of the board. And the poem ends, how did I get this wrong? Had I embellished, exaggerated the tale? Had Mom, because it had a more silvery sheen? So that's sort of getting at what you're getting at. Yeah, how do we know these things? And how do we trust? Uh-huh.
Right. No, the family myths are hard to let go of, aren't they?
Because that's a real silvery sheen about that.
Yeah, yeah.
It wasn't him at all.
And I love this poem because I love how you say false. You know what I mean? And then like you're like, it's not debunked one way, it's debunked like 3 different ways, you know.
Right.
Yeah, that's great. And that attests to the honesty that you know, Natalia mentioned earlier, how this is a very brave speaker and journey that you went on to write this book, because you are not gonna stop. You know what I mean? You're gonna get at it and get at it until you have the truth, the best truth that you can tell. So it's wonderful being with the speaker as they're on that journey, you know, with all the difficult points. I loved Latent Image because it's such a difficult story about your mother being photographed by your grandfather when she's 7 and she's naked, and then it's offset with these wonderful descriptions of the photographic process that made the photograph that was so hard for your mother. And I loved just the very delicate emotional dance between those two parts in that poem. So I could go on and on, but it was really what, you know, it was very, it fed me a lot to read that. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Oh my
There's
goodness.
such a density in the poems, and yet they're so light. It's like that incredible craft in the ivory that you described, Wendy. That's just, it's dense and it's hard and it has an ugly past, and yet it just looks so beautiful. It makes you hurt. That's how I see these poems.
Your words mean so much. Oh, you guys, thank you over and over.
Thank you.
Thanks. a million.
Natalia, yeah, you have it in, yeah, Blake was great, put all these great links in the chat. Does anyone have one final burning question they want to ask Wendy to close out the night? Or are you just like, no, I want to go back and read the book or finish reading it or reread it?
John put his hand up. John? Yeah?
Yes, I have a question. If your books are primarily memoirs, when can we expect the Steve and Wendy one?
Well, there's a poem in a book called Poems of Paradise. It's about Steve, if you want to find it. It's called If a God.
God, that's great.
Very good.
My favorite poem.
I love that book so much.
That's
It's so
relations
gorgeous.
there.
Only yes, if a God comes to you, and it goes on from there.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So you all are incredible. It's just so wonderful to be with you tonight. And Blake and David and Alexandra, thank you so much. And Natalia, oh my goodness, thanks for your great questions.
Thank
Really
you.
insightful, and wow, all of you. So
No, our pleasure, Wendy. Yeah.
And I would just want to say thanks to everyone who came out to join
Yes,
us tonight. It was just great to
absolutely.
see all of
I
your
know
faces.
you all are super busy, so thanks a million.
So thanks everyone. It was so great having you, Wendy and Natalia. Thank you for your wonderful questions. And our next author is Antonio Ruiz Camacho, December 11th, I believe. So keep that in mind. Join us for that. But Wendy, just a delight. Great to have all this literary discussion and just to hear your great work. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everyone. We hope to see you soon. Stay safe.
We love you, Wendy.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Wendy. Thank you,
Thanks
Natalia.
so much, all of you. Thanks a million. Yeah,
Love to everybody.
you all take care.
Bye, Steve.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Natalia. You were amazing.
Hope I see you
Come
soon.
back.
Absolutely,
Come
yeah.
back.
Too.